Hi, everyone. Welcome to the seminar. We are happy to have Amanda Coston with us today. Amanda is currently a postdoc with Microsoft Research in their statistics and machine learning team. She got her PhD in machine learning and public policy at CMU, and she holds a bachelor's in computer science from Princeton. And starting fall 2024, she will be an assistant professor in the statistics department at UC Berkeley. Amanda's research is in investigating the validity, equity, and governance of data-driven algorithms used in societally consequential settings. And today, she will tell us about the validity and fairness of predictive AI. It's all yours, Amanda.
Great. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks so much to you all for joining. I'm really excited to present my work on examining the validity and fairness of predictive AI used to inform decisions in societally high-stakes settings. So I'll define most of those terms as we get into the talk. But for now, I'd just like to point out that my focus today is going to be on what I call predictive AI. And I'm using that to contrast with what we hear a lot about these days, especially in the media, these large-scale generative models like ChatGPT. So we're not going to be focusing on those, although at the end, if there's interest, we could discuss kind of how some of the ideas we go over today may or may not apply in that new setting. But to set the scope here, we're going to look at predictive models trained using classical machine learning techniques and see how those are used in high-stakes decision-making settings. As many of you are probably well aware, these kind of predictive models are used in a variety of important settings like healthcare, child welfare, criminal justice, and consumer lending. And so the predictive algorithm we're looking at is often trained for a particular task in these contexts. Like in the consumer lending setting, the algorithm will be trained to predict the likelihood an applicant for a consumer loan would default if that loan were approved. So throughout the talk, I'll refer to these algorithms using interchangeably the terms predictive AI, machine learning tool, and predictive model. And I'm really interested in how well the kinds of quantities these algorithms are predicting actually align with what we want them to predict and what we think they're predicting. So in today's talk, we'll talk about this idea through the lens of validity, and we'll see how this is really important for fairness and how a lot of factors affect this process. So the beginning of this talk might be a little familiar to any of those you in the audience who attended the multi-group fairness and validity workshop last spring and saw my talk on validity there. But today we'll go into more depth and get into some new material as well. Okay, so the agenda for today's talk is we'll discuss what validity is in the context of predictive AI, why it matters for fairness, and then we'll see how to identify and manage validity issues using statistical tools. And then we'll broaden our focus to look at how organizational structures and power dynamics in practice can affect our ability to scrutinize for validity and fairness. Okay, so to get us started thinking about this concept of validity, I think it's useful to look at this quote by Albert Einstein, that if he had an hour to solve a problem, he'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about the solution. Right, so the idea being that it's really important to understand the problem that we're going after to make sure that we're actually devising a solution for that problem. And when we don't do this, sometimes the solutions we come up with actually don't align with what we think we're doing and what we want to do. And so I propose validity as a nice lens to look at this. And so by validity, I'm referring to the scientific or statistical definition of validity, which requires that a measure, so this says that a measure is valid if it assesses the concept that we intend for it to measure. So this concept of validity has a long literature in the social sciences, particularly psychometrics and experimental research, and more recently, human-computer interaction. And we can make this idea a little more concrete with an example. So the example I'm going to use is from the SAT that's used for college admissions. So the SAT exam used to include analogy questions, questions like runner is to marathon, as oarsman is to regatta. And these questions, these analogy questions were used to assess the relationship between these concepts. But critics pointed out that instead, this question was more likely to assess socioeconomic privilege, because some kids may have had the opportunity to go to a regatta and know what that is, and other kids may not have. So then this raised the question, how valid are these analogy questions at assessing language skills? And so note that I say how valid, because this notion of validity is generally not something that we can prove holds decidedly. Instead, we should think of assessing validity as assessing whether there is strong or weak evidence in support of this claim. Okay, so what does this concept of validity mean now in our algorithmic setting? What does this mean for predictive AI? So in this setting, validity means that we're asking to what extent the model predicts the quantity that we think it does. And this seemingly basic question of whether the model is actually doing what it's supposed to do is really important. It doesn't always hold. When it doesn't, it can impact fairness. And in practice, it's not as easy to assess as we might expect. Many models fail to meet this requirement due to unaddressed challenges or problem formulation issues. So my talk will consider these challenges in the context of, so before I get into that, let's just connect this to fairness, which I know is of concern to a lot of folks in this audience and a research area that many of you consider. So why is validity important for fairness and equity? So often inequities we observe can be traced to validity issues. And I'll give a few examples from my research and from other related work. Throughout these examples, we'll be interested in evaluation. So we'll assume that we have a given algorithm or set of algorithms, and we'd like to evaluate its performance and fairness properties. Okay, so I'll start with an example from related work that you may be familiar with. This example is in the healthcare settings, where we're looking at an algorithm that's used to inform patient care decisions. And the goal is that we hope this algorithm can help identify patients who have complex health needs. And this 2019 investigation into a commonly used algorithm showed that it's miscalibrated by race. That is, for the same percentile of risk score predicted by the algorithm that's shown here on the x-axis, Black patients were considerably sicker. So we can see that because the purple curve here showing Black patients has higher values of chronic conditions on the y-axis than the orange curve. So we might wonder, like, how could this happen? Wouldn't the developers have checked something as basic as calibration by race? And they did, but they checked this with respect to a different outcome. The outcome the model was trained to predict, which was future healthcare costs. And the designers had intended this as a proxy for the outcome they really care about, which is health needs. But the issue is that health costs don't approximate health needs well for historically underserved populations. So the question then is whether this algorithm that predicts healthcare costs is valid for the original goal of assessing patient needs. And we see that this is closely tied to concerns about equity and bias raised in this 2019 paper. And this use of proxy outcomes is just one common challenge to validity, but there are a number of others. My second example is work I've done in consumer lending, where we're looking at algorithms that are used to make loan decisions. We worked with a bank in Australia that was interested in finding a more equitable credit lending model, but they didn't want to deploy a model that would actually impact their bottom line, that would have lower performance. So they wanted a model that was more equitable, but still roughly comparable to their baseline model. And in the Australian setting, they were concerned about historical inequities in credit across geographies, that residents in rural areas were traditionally underbanked, and they're interested in whether they can expand credit access to those applicants from rural areas. So here I'll present a plot of a measure of disparity across geography. This is on the x-axis, where I'm using a equals 1 to denote that the applicant was from a historically disadvantaged or underbanked region, and a equals 0 to denote that they were not. And so we plot this measure of disparity against the AUC on the y-axis for several candidate models. And here this suggests that we must either have the usual trade-off, that we must either trade off performance or fairness. But there's an important point here about who this evaluation is conducted on. So this is just approved applicants, those who got the loan, and we can see their default or repayment outcomes. But our goal, of course, was to assess any applicant's likelihood of repayment. When we deploy the tool, we're going to use it on the full set of applicants. And the set of approved applicants can be different in important ways from the full population on which the tool will be used. So we use a semi-synthetic analysis to estimate what these performance and fairness metrics would be like on the full population. The challenge is that we don't actually observe the repayment outcomes there, but we can estimate those under some assumptions in this semi-synthetic setup. And here, this paints a different picture. So the green model is now among the best performing, and it significantly minimizes disparities. So the question of whether evaluations are valid for the population on which we'll use the algorithm is really important for determining which model aligns with our fairness and equity goals. And for our third example, we'll look at another common threat to validity that concerns missing data in the outcomes. And my work has investigated this in the context of child welfare screening, where algorithms are used to inform decisions about whether to screen in a case for investigation. So in this setting, the goal is that the algorithm should predict the likelihood of an adverse child welfare outcome if the agency doesn't take any action. So they call that screening the case out. So for this example, I'll get into some details and describe some notation, because then we'll move into some of the math behind this and how we can actually address these issues. Okay, so call workers will make a decision, which I'll denote with D, whether to screen in a case, and that means the agency is going to investigate and potentially offer services, or whether to screen that case out. And we'd like to evaluate how well the algorithm they're using to inform their decisions predicts child welfare outcomes. So for the outcome that we'll look at here is whether the case was referred again at a later time. And we'll denote this outcome as Y. So we observe these outcomes under the decision that the call worker makes. So suppose the worker decides to investigate, and suppose the investigation identifies that the family needs food support and the agency provides services to meet that need. Then we may observe a positive outcome after investigating. But counterfactually, had the call worker made the alternate decision to screen the case out, the family still would have had those food needs, but would not have had services offered by the county. So we may have observed a different outcome. Now, since the caseworkers are tasked with assessing the likelihood of harm if they don't investigate, that is under screen out, then this is the outcome that we want to evaluate our algorithm against. So the standard approach in this kind of setting and what the county was doing would only evaluate the performance of the algorithm on instances where we've observed this outcome of interest. So we can see this with a simple tabular example. So suppose we observe this data. On the left-hand side, we have our covariates or predictive features X. Then we have recorded the call worker's decision to either screen out the case or to investigate it. Then we have this potential outcome of interest that's only partially observed for cases. We only see it for cases that were screened out, and we don't know what it is for cases that were investigated. And then we have our algorithmic prediction on the right-hand side. So the standard approach would evaluate the performance on rows 1 and 3, where we have the label to compare against, and we just ignore rows 2 and 4. But the problem here is similar to what we were discussing in the lending setting, that the population that got the proposed decision is often different in important ways from the full population on which the machine learning tool will be used. So performance on this bias subsample may not provide a good estimate of performance on the full population. So this is just a stylized example, but here, we would estimate the accuracy to be 100%, which would be misleading because the algorithm could actually make mistakes that we don't detect on cases that were investigated. Okay, so let's see how to address this. So the next section is going to consider how techniques from causal inference can help us address the missing outcome data and selection bias threats to validity. So we can address forms of missing data and selection bias with counterfactual estimation when key conditions holds. And I'll sketch the big picture of how we do this and then delve into a bit of math. So I'll use this child welfare example that we presented as a case of missing outcome data, but we can analogously formulate the consumer lending example in this way and everything will hold. So recall that the issue we're facing is that we have missing outcomes for cases that were investigated because we're interested in what would have happened if no investigation had occurred. And we'll use counterfactual estimation techniques from causal inference to estimate these missing outcomes. And then one approach we could do would just be use these estimated values to fill in these missing cells and then compute our evaluation as we normally would. But that kind of simple plug-in type approach isn't going to be the most efficient generally. To get efficient estimates of the performance metrics that we'd like to compute, like accuracy or false positive rate, we'll also adjust the observed outcomes in a way that corrects the bias of our estimated unknown outcomes. Okay, so now let's see how this works in detail. So I'll show how to do this for a particular performance metric, precision. And I chose this metric because it has a more simple form than some other metrics. But in this 2020 paper, we have details on how to do it for other metrics if those are of interest. So the first line here, I've written the counterfactual analog of precision. So you might think of precision as just being the likelihood the outcome equals 1 for among those where we predicted it to be 1. But in this setting, we're going to use as our target the counterfactual outcome. And it's going to be helpful to write precision in terms of this function mu, which is an outcome regression function. This is a nuisance function. It's not something that we directly care about, but will be useful for identifying and estimating the quantity that we do care about here, which is precision. And so we can identify these counterfactual quantities in the observed data under 3 assumptions. So we are going to assume that we've measured all features affecting both the decision and the outcome. And this would hold, for instance, if we've measured all risk factors that are used by the call screener to make their decision. Then we're also going to assume that all cases have some probability of getting the proposed decision. And third, we assume that there's no interference between units. This assumption is called consistency. So together, these assumptions enable us to write the outcome regression nuisance functions in terms of observable quantities. So this is known as identification. So we can identify the outcome regression nuisance function as the likelihood of the observed outcome, Y, conditional on X, among those observed to get screened out. And then because we started by writing precision in terms of this function mu, this means we've also identified precision. Okay, so now we know how to write this counterfactual or hypothetical quantities in terms of observable things we see in the data. All that remains is we need to figure out how to estimate this quantity. And I gave a preview of how we would do this, saying that we're going to bias correct the observed outcomes to do this efficiently. And this is using a set of techniques that go by many names: double machine learning, targeted machine learning, doubly robust techniques. These all refer to this process of constructing bias-corrected estimators for a function of our data distribution. And this is really nice because depending on your setting, this gives us favorable theoretical guarantees like robustness to misspecification or second-order error terms. And this approach, this double machine learning or doubly robust approach, is rooted in semi-parametric theory. And there's been a large body of work developing these estimators for common causal inference problems. However, no prior work had adapted these techniques to the predictive AI, the algorithmic decision support setting that we've been talking about, where the estimands are different than in the standard causal inference setup. So like much of this literature, our estimators will make use of sample splitting techniques that have long been studied in the literature on adaptive estimation. Okay, so let's get into how this looks like for precision. I'm going to present our double machine learning estimator for precision, and I'll try to build this up in a way that's hopefully a little bit intuitive. So to estimate precision, we have to estimate the nuisance functions. So we've already seen this nuisance function mu, and we've seen the nuisance function pi briefly when I introduced the assumptions. So this is the treatment assignment function or the propensity score function that's describing how likely you are to get treatment conditional on the covariance X. And we can use whatever we like to estimate these functions. Ideally, we'll use some kind of machine learning or flexible non-parametric regression to do this. And then a simple approach to estimating precision on the full population would just average the outcome regression estimates among those flagged as high risk to get an estimate of precision on the full population. Okay, so you could do this and that would give you an estimate of precision, but the problem is that this method incurs bias because we're using an estimate of mu. So now we're going to pull in our estimate of pi and correct for this bias using an inverse probability weighted residual. So this bias correction term is taking the residual, the difference in the observed outcome and our prediction, and inversely weighing it by our estimate of pi. And we estimate these nuisance functions on a different split of the data than what we use to compute the performance metric. And then you can use cross-fitting to regain sample efficiency. So we derive the form of this bias correction for each performance metric using its influence function. That's one process for constructing these kind of estimators. And here's what that looks like for several common predictive performance metrics. So because we construct these estimators to have the double machine learning bias correction term that we got using the influence function, this means that we can get root n rates in settings where we can estimate the nuisance functions at n to the quarter rates. So we can then use flexible machine learning to estimate the nuisance functions without relying on parametric assumptions and still get confidence intervals around our performance estimate. Okay, so that's how we use double machine learning to come up with estimates for these counterfactual evaluation metrics to address the problem where we have a missing outcome data. So now that we have this approach, we might wonder, does this actually make a difference in practice? How would this compare, for instance, to the standard approach that I described that was commonly used before, where you would just, evaluate on the rows where you've actually observed the outcome of interest? So to investigate this, I'll present results on data from the Child Welfare Agency in Allegheny County. So our data is from Allegheny County Department of Human Services from 2010 to 2014 with over 35,000 unique referrals to the hotline. And the features in the data include criminal justice history, child welfare history, substance abuse, demographic information, public benefits, the allegation type in the call. And the adverse outcome of interest is whether the family will be referred again to the hotline within 6 months. So with this data, we're going to set up an empirical analysis to compare two predictive models one that we know to be valid in a counterfactual sense and one that we know is not. And we'd like to see which evaluation approach, the one I presented using double machine learning or the standard one, can signal that this valid model is the better one, that that's the one we should use. So I'm calling this a counterfactually valid model because this model, it was trained to predict the outcome that we care about, the potential or counterfactual outcome under screen out. And then the invalid model has been trained to just predict the observed outcome. So in practice, this can make a really big difference, what outcome we train on. So to see this, here I'm showing a plot of predicted risk densities for both of these predictive models on this Allegheny County data. And we've cased out the risk predictions for 4 interventions. The green shows cases that were screened out. We'd expect these to be the lowest risk if the caseworkers are good at discerning risk. Then in yellow, we have cases that were investigated. And then in pink, we have cases that were investigated and where the county offered services. And then in red, we have cases where the child was removed from home and placed into the foster care system. We would expect those to be the highest risk. So the model on the top shows this expected trend. But according to the model in the bottom, the one that was just trained on the observed outcome, we see this kind of unexpected, or what might seem to be unexpected results, that those who receive services in pink had among the lowest predicted risk. But that's because this model was trained on the observed outcome. And since the services the county provides can mitigate risk, that's what we would hope they would do, then it makes sense that those who got services might have a low risk of the observed outcome under this historical decision. However, it would be misguided to use this model for future decision-making because this would screen out families who were likely to benefit, the very ones the agency might be able to help if they were to screen them in and identify that they could offer these services to mitigate risk. So this is just some motivation for why this counterfactual model is really the one we want to identify as being better. And now we're going to look at whether the our evaluation approaches can actually reflect this. So the standard evaluation approach would suggest that these models perform comparably. So here I'm showing the ROC curves, which show recall or true positive rate against false positive rate. And curves that bend toward the upper left are better. So our counterfactual evaluation that estimates performance on the full population, it shows the expected results that the counterfactual prediction model in orange outperforms the invalid model in blue. Okay, so now let's zoom out and think about how this connects to the opening where we broadly considered the validity of predictive AI. So we've seen how we can use statistical techniques to address a particular threat to validity when we know that it's a concern. So here it was missing outcome data, but we could devise the solution to this problem once we pinpointed it. But how about the question of how to identify validity issues in the first place? Like, how did we know that missing outcome data was a problem we needed to address in this setting? This question, how do we identify validity issues, I think is really interesting because it requires that we anticipate a wide range of validity issues. So ideally, we would have sorry, I just want to make sure I could see the time to keep a check on it. Okay, so ideally we would have a comprehensive framework of threats to validity. But of course, that's quite challenging to do comprehensively. So as a first step, we draw on the social sciences literature on validity to propose a taxonomy of validity issues in this predictive AI context. So now I'll get into this taxonomy of validity threats, and we'll connect some of the issues that we've been talking about in this framework. So as a reminder, when we talk about validity, we're interested in the extent to which the model does what it purports to do, and will now map ideas from validity theory in the social sciences to common threats to validity we've seen in the algorithmic decision-making setting. So we'll start by looking at construct validity. Construct validity is concerned with whether the measure captures what the researcher intended to measure. Scholars of modern validity theory often consider this to be the broad overarching concern of validity research. And translating this to our predictive AI setting would require us to assess whether the algorithm predicts the intended quantity. And of course, we've already discussed in this talk that it can be hard to observe in the data the quantity we'd like to predict. We might only have a proxy outcome, or we might only partially observe this for some cases. And we've seen how proxies can be harmful when there's little construct validity, how healthcare costs can be a harmful proxy for healthcare needs, especially for vulnerable groups. But even when we've properly specified and estimated our target using, for instance, in the case of missing data, using the double machine learning approach we discussed, we can still have validity issues due to other reasons. To see this, we'll now turn to some concepts of validity from experimental research. We'll begin with internal validity that considers the extent to which claims holds in a particular study. So often these claims are causal. So this is asking to what extent the relationship identified is causal. Then we translate this to our algorithmic decision-making context. Then this would require us to assess the degree to which the predictive relationship the model learns corresponds to a plausible causal relationship. And an example where this likely does not hold is video-based hiring assessments. So in this example, an applicant describes themselves in a 30-second video that's used to produce scores that the company claims describes job relevant features like how adventurous, cultured, or sensitive the applicant is. And this has generated a lot of controversy because it's not clear that the data from this video has any predictive validity for actually assessing these job relevant skills. So more generally, to make meaningful predictions, we need data on relevant predictive factors. And if there's no plausible causal path between the feature and the target outcome, then we say there is attribute misalignment. And including such features in our predictive model could jeopardize validity. And another important type of validity is external validity. So this concerns the degree to which the claims hold true in real world settings. In our algorithmic decision-making setting, this requires that we assess how well claims about the algorithm's performance and fairness properties hold for real world contexts. So in other words, to what extent are metrics that we compute on the available data externally valid for the target population on which the tool will be used. And we've already seen an example where this is a concern, the child welfare setting, where standard approaches would evaluate on a biased subsample of the population, where we've observed the outcome of interest, but performance on this biased subsample may not be reflective of performance on the full population. So in order to anticipate this kind of misalignment, we need to assess when the data set does not represent the target population. And of course, we'll always have some temporal shift. This is unavoidable. We have, training data from the past and we're interested in things in the future, but it's also important that we understand additional sources of selection bias or distribution shifts. So there are kind of common structures that arise and can cause issues here. Like we saw how in consumer lending, we only observe repayment outcomes for applicants whose loan is granted, but we care about performance on the full population. And it's really important that any fairness properties we assess are externally valid on the target population. So we can use the counterfactual evaluation method I proposed, that using those double machine learning estimators earlier to address this if the assumptions required, the identifying assumptions we talked to are reasonable to make in this setting. Okay, so putting this all together, we've discussed these common threats to validity and seen that we can address some of these misalignments using statistical methods when key conditions hold. But these kind of statistical quantitative solutions can only get us so far when the target setting we're working in are complex socio-technical systems, where social structures and the organizational makeup of these systems play a role in validity and fairness. So in the last few minutes of this talk, I'm going to present some results where we're trying to work to better understand this by investigating how decisions to adopt these tools are made in practice. So we conduct a qualitative analysis into how decisions about AI design and adoption are influenced by various stakeholders. And we're looking at the public sector context. So the results I'll present here are from 16 semi-structured interviews from workers at public sector agencies in the US. We interviewed agency leaders, data scientists, and frontline workers. And our coding methodology uses reflexive thematic analysis. So the findings that I'd like to highlight in our talk today are we find that forces around the agency can constrain their ability to conduct fairness and validity work on predictive AI. So agency members would share with us that they might be concerned about fairness in a particular algorithm and want to do some assessments or see, what kind of mitigations they might consider. But there often would be pre-existing procurement contracts that would lock in vendor companies that had developed and were selling them the AI. And that would make it really hard for the agency to actually have any leverage over these companies. They might go and ask them to do this, but the vendor company wouldn't really spend any time conducting that fairness assessment or giving the agency any additional insight. So we also find that the organizational structures can make it hard for workers in different parts of the agency to interact with each other. So in particular, frontline workers and data scientists each have, different types of knowledge that are relevant for the setting at hand. The frontline workers can understand a lot about the domain in which the algorithm's used and how it's being used. And the data scientists, of course, have the knowledge of how these predictive models are trained and evaluated. And we found that there are often silos that make it hard for these frontline workers and data scientists to interact with the regularity and ease that would be necessary to discuss and resolve their concerns. So often those concerns kind of remain unaddressed. And finally, participants expressed a desire to engage impacted community members in this process, but said that this was hard in practice because of limited resources and support and knowledge of how to do this within the agency. So these all point to additional issues that kind of should, I think be going around in our mind when we're thinking about the statistical solutions we're developing and how far that will get us and what kind of broader issues we need to address in order to actually address fairness and validity of predictive AI. Okay, so as a summary, we look at the question of validity if the predictive model does what it's supposed to do. We saw how models can fail in practice to meet this when there's misalignment in the predictive target, the attributes used as predictive variables, or misalignment in what population we're training and evaluating on versus the population where the tool will actually be deployed on. Some specific issues that we discussed and addressed are counterfact challenges arising when we have counterfactual targets, missing data, and selection bias. We saw several examples where fairness issues could be traced to unaddressed validity concerns. And finally, we just discussed how, in addition to statistical solution, organizational structures need to support the ability to achieve fairness and validity goals. Okay, so I just would like to acknowledge my collaborators, including Alex and Edwards, who are PhD advisors for much of this work. And thank you all for your time, and happy to open it up now to questions or discussion.
Thank you, Amanda. If there are any questions from the audience, feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
Thanks for the talk. Really interesting. Maybe it's more of a simple question to start out with. Understanding that validity is.
Why don't you introduce yourself just briefly?
Oh yeah, sure. My name is Una. I'm a doctoral student from Munich, and I'm working also on like automated decision-making systems and for especially in like the society decision-making context. So this is quite close to my work and my interests. So thank you very much. And I think you very nicely structured the different questions and issues that I'm also kind of grappling with. And we know a lot of negative examples surrounding these types of decision-making systems. I would be curious if you've encountered something that you would call a valid system. I mean, understanding that it's not like a binary label, but have you seen decision-making systems that basically check all the boxes that you've laid out here?
That's a good question. Yeah, I don't know that I would be willing to commit to kind of saying that one checks all the boxes. I will think more about that offline. It would be nice if there were like a very positive example like that. I do think it's an interesting question, like how many of those boxes need to be checked in order to kind of justify the deployment of the algorithm. Like how, like in these settings, a lot of these, it's going to be impossible to really have something that's valid because often, like when we're in these societally high stakes settings, you're interested in kind of some measure of future human behavior, and we never have that perfectly measured. You often rely on these proxy outcomes. So how do we kind of trade off, even when we can do, the best statistical techniques and everything, we're just constrained by that data. So how do we trade off kind of the known issues that will arise in that setting versus what we hope might be the benefits and potentially like efficiency or accuracy that you would get by having a decision aid. So yeah, that's a question that I'm kind of interested in thinking about for future research. Like how do we do something like cost benefit analysis there, or at least making transparent like what boxes are checked off. So that's something that like the agency could release to the community, and at least people can then have more information and like being part of this conversation about whether that system should be in place or not.
Yeah, thank you. Makes a lot of sense that it's probably very context dependent.
Yeah.
Amanda, I have another question. Thank you for this talk. It's very reassuring that we social scientists have something to offer here.
Yes.
What I was wondering is, to which extent or which of these concepts do you feel are really some that are important or that the CS communities might not have on their radar, as opposed to those with just different labels, like how one talks about the problem, right? I mean, the positivity assumptions or distribution shift, there's a direct link of sort of, parts of the sample for which your data or the model wasn't trained, and then it's deployed or deployed in a different context and it happens. But those things are discussed under other labels. And I always wonder sort of what are the really, like when you started to apply the validity frameworks that you see in the social sciences, was there something where it's like, oh wow, this element is really helpful because we don't have that under a different label. We actually didn't know about those problems.
Yeah. I think the one that emerged for me, but I think there probably could be others. And so it'd be definitely interesting to spend more time talking to someone like yourself, or other folks in the area who might have ideas. But the one that emerged for me that didn't really fit into the kind of issues I presented in the beginning of the talk was this one in the middle, the attribute misalignment. So, what we call target misalignment, that kind of emerges in a lot of the literature with proxy outcomes, or we fit in the counterfactual targets there. But this kind of, what would seem to be a more basic requirement, but that still actually can fail in settings, that there has to be this plausible, either indirect or direct, but some kind of causal path between features and the predictive target. This was inspired by thinking about like what face validity would mean in the algorithmic context. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I'm just noticing the formatting is off there, but okay. And the population misalignment one, I'll fix that. Yeah, so does that kind of answer your question? That was one of the kind of unique insights that emerged using the social science framework. But additionally, it was kind of useful to organize these other, what kind of felt like a hodgepodge of issues into this kind of taxonomy that structured like where sources of misalignment could happen. I think it's also possible that, there are additional things that should be part of this framework. And so if folks have ideas on that, that's something I'm very interested in.
Thanks.
Hi, Amanda. I have a question. So, I'm Rakshit. So I'm a doctoral student at Georgia Tech, and I work on privacy and fairness as well. So this talk is really helpful. Thank you so much for this. And yeah, my question was on have you come across any work that like looks at validity theory in terms of like aggregation functions? So for example, let's say I take I consider the setting of maybe distillation or possibly even federated learning. So is it possible to have like, to see like certain models actually like end up performing better in terms of like fairness compared to the other models? So how do you exactly like apply this theory when it comes to like aggregating this model as aggregating several models into one single model as such? So yeah, do you have any thoughts about this?
Okay. So that sounds like an interesting direction. Let me make sure I understand your question. So you're interested in validity when you have like multiple different algorithms that you're aggregating into some kind of like, is this like, are you talking about like an ensemble setting, or you're particularly interested in like, okay. Yeah, I mean, yeah, so at one layer of abstraction, you can still kind of think of an ensemble algorithm as, even though it is, an ensemble of multiple algorithms, you can think of it as just one algorithm, this kind of black box, and still kind of ask some of the same questions about like what target you've been predicting and what predictive attributes you use to do that, and what population you're training and evaluating on. It might be interesting though, if because that there's that structure, that it's an ensemble of multiple algorithms, whether there's kind of more you can do to break down the analysis. Like also you mentioned kind of model distillation or federated learning. Can you say a little bit more about kind of what issues you're thinking about in those settings?
So I'm just trying to think about how the aggregation actually affects validity theory. So in federated learning, we have this algorithm which is very popular called federated averaging. So you have n different models, and these models end up getting aggregated on the server. What you do is that you have these models as like M1 to Mn, and what you do is that you just take a simple average over all of these models, right? So I'm wondering how you actually like how this averaging process actually affects validity theory.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I haven't seen anyone look at that, but I can imagine there'd be a lot of interesting questions raised there. In particular, like if some of the models that you're averaging are not valid or less valid, and others are more valid, like under what conditions would the kind of averaging correct things or make things worse? That could be pretty interesting to look at.
I see. Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Are there more questions? If not, we can end it here. Let me stop.